Hi everyone, welcome to our first flip video for our agriculture unit, and we are logically going to begin taking a look at the origins of agriculture, and we'll follow up with the next video about how agriculture has changed over time. So let's start off with the simple essential question: what are the origins of agriculture? To get into our discussion about agriculture, we need to talk about the different types of economic activities that exist in societies. Starting off, there are five, but then we're going to generalize. We're going to talk about all five, and then we're going to generalize three of them together. Primary economic activities are what most people in LDCs will be doing, which are occupations whereby people are extracting resources directly from the earth, like agriculture. So if your occupation is to farm, then you are directly extracting um, plant or crops from the earth. Similarly, if you're in mining, then you're extracting raw materials directly from the earth in the mines. People who are involved in secondary economic activities, so this is where the majority of the population will work in a developing country. In secondary economic activities, people will use the raw materials that have been extracted from the earth in order to create something new. Let's think of this like primary is be chopping down the wood, chopping down trees, and then that secondary economic activity would be taking that lumber and using it to create something through construction. So extracting and then creating, so is primary versus secondary. Tertiary economic services are where most people in MDCs will be employed. These are services or professional communities, so doctors, teachers, people in retail shops, truck drivers. These are people who are not directly involved in the acquiring resources or making something from those resources, but rather are involved in the distribution of a good or in providing a service to people. Here is where we'll find most people from MDCs. Now I'm gonna generalize. Now I put the tertiary, quaternary, and quinary into green to indicate that in the AP Human Geography exam, well, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some of the textbooks seem to indicate that there are these five levels of economic activity. Some indicate that there's only primary, secondary, and tertiary. So have it in your mind that some geographers would qualify tertiary, quaternary, and quinary as all just simply tertiary jobs, jobs that would be involved with the most developed societies. So let's now break down what the next levels would be. Quaternary would be people who process, administer, and create process and administer, not create. In process and administer information. Excuse me. So I think of this more along the lines of what government officials do. Something on the order of that you're giving information to groups of people, you're making decisions to guide groups of people. Now, quinary would be at the very top here because you're actually creating new information in a quinary job. So I consider these, if I think of a quinary job, I'm thinking of researchers. I'm thinking of people who are out there creating new ideas about the world and proving those theories. Again, let's consider that tertiary, quaternary, and quinary, if we were to consider them all as one category, these would be the types of jobs that would be found by the majority of the population, or be that the majority of the population in a most developed country would be employed in. I bring this up to say that the primary, secondary, and tertiary jobs are a way to differentiate groups of people. And one of the ways that groups of people are differentiated is the way in which they feed themselves. Because if your population is primarily involved in primary economic activities, such as agriculture, then your society is sort of limited in its ability to develop. So we're going to kind of use this idea of what percentage of the population is involved in primary, secondary, and tertiary activities for the next 3 units for agriculture, for our rural land use, urban land use, and economic activities. Anywho, so that sets us up for our discussion about agriculture. So agriculture, as I just mentioned, is a primary economic activity, and as I wrote here, it occupies a large part of rural land use. Just because you live in a rural area doesn't necessitate or mean that you're necessarily a farmer. But on the whole, if we're looking at a global scale, then the vast majority of the people living in rural areas are by trade farmers. Again, that's not generalized entirely but on the whole, on a global level, that statement generally reigns true. That rural land is primarily used across the Earth's surface for farming and for agriculture. Agriculture, definition of, is be the purposeful modification of Earth's surface to either A, plant crops, or B, raise livestock for human sustenance and economic gain. If you didn't know what that word sustenance, meaning survival, think of it I heard a student once use the word sustenance to describe what they need most after the end, this end of the school days. They need some sustenance. They need food. So sustenance is just what keeps us alive, what things we need for our survival. So agriculture applies both to actual farm planting and developing crops, and specifically for raising livestock. That's important. There are two major types of agriculture. There's subsistence agriculture and there's commercial agriculture. And we're going to dive far more deeply into these two types of agriculture in something like two flip videos from now. But generally speaking, we can consider that subsistence agriculture is done when, or is applies to agriculture where it applies to the practice of growing food for your personal sustenance and the sustenance of your family. So if you're growing food for your survival and the survival of your family, that's considered to be subsistence agriculture, as opposed to commercial agriculture. And when commercial agriculture, the purpose is to grow food for the specific purpose of selling it off the farm. So to other groups of people, other geographic locations, so on and so forth. Two key types. Which brings us to a discussion of where do these things occur and where did agriculture occur. So just to show you this two quick maps. This map here is the areas of the world that are primarily dominated by subsistence agriculture. These are the areas of the world primarily dominated by commercial agriculture. My AP human geographers out there have probably already figured out that this is a key difference between LDCs of the world and the MDCs of the world. Again, something we're going to dive more deeply into later. So, where did agriculture come from? People were not always farmers. In fact, people were originally hunter-gatherers. And our style of life and style of human existence was having small nomadic groups of people. Nomadic meaning no clear place of settlement. In those nomadic groups, there are very clear gender roles. Men were the hunters and women were the gatherers. So men would hunt game and animals, and women would be in charge of gathering berries and nuts and things like that. There are very, very, very few hunter gatherers left in the world. That we know this already because we know from our demographic transition model that there are no countries of the world who are currently in stage one, which meaning a hunter gatherer society. There are certain groups of people, the Kalahari Bushmen, there's some Amazonian groups, that still practice hunting gathering, but for the most part, the vast, vast, vast majority of the world practices and feeds itself based upon agriculture. That's a little repeat on that first bullet point. No need to write it twice. So, where did agriculture come from? It began with the first agricultural revolution. So, you can see on my timeline up there, it's just some of our history skills here, looking at Common Era and before Common Era. First agricultural revolution is believed to have occurred in 10,000 BCE, which is, if it's 2015 right now, then that was approximately 12,000 years ago. So this is no recent event. This is a very long time ago. The first agricultural revolution is marked by the domestication of plants and animals. So meaning the beginning of farming and the beginning of deliberately breeding and deliberately training, I guess not training quite the right word, but deliberately utilizing animals for human gain. So this, as I said, around 10,000 BCE, and this led to the development of communities because if people are no longer having to move around to find food, they can stay in one place with farming. That then was what led to people being able to live in cities and living, well, that's a jump, living in one permanent location and then ultimately creating permanent communities. All of that's rooted back to this first agricultural revolution. You can see that little graphic there that our domestication of animals means that animals, the physical genetic traits of the animal would change through the breeding of animals and the way in which we use the animals. So the conventional idea, meaning the traditional idea of where agriculture began. The traditional idea is that it began in what's called the Fertile Crescent. You may have studied this in elementary school if you learned about Mesopotamia and the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. If you see on the map here, that's indicated by that area number that's labeled as number 1. It's in the Western Asian region. That is modern day countries of Iraq. We got a little bit touching into Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, Syria, many of the areas of the world, in fact, in much conflict right now. But that's called the Fertile Crescent. And you can see sort of the shape that's made by number 1. This is the Fertile Crescent, just like a crescent-shaped moon. The Fertile Crescent is believed to be, by many historians and geographers alike, to be the first place where agriculture began. Now we're going to take a look actually at a different concept. The geographer Carl Sayer came up with a slightly alternative um, idea of where agriculture began, and he based his ideas on. This is the same guy, by the way, who discussed the cultural landscape as the means through which we should analyze groups of people. So anyway, looping back to the unit one from there. He divided his study of agriculture into two types of agriculture: vegetative agriculture and seed agriculture. And he said that these practices actually began in two separate places. Vegetative agriculture is when you can directly clone one plant from another. So this is quite simply, if you had a plant, and not all plants can be cloned in this way, but some can, where you would cut the stem or cut a branch or cut a part of the root of one plant, replant that, and then the plant will grow. That's vegetative. So essentially taking one plant and directly creating another from based upon that plant itself. Most plants are come from most crops, most things that grow come from seed agriculture when things are directly grown from those seeds. Carl Sayer divided the development of agriculture into where vegetative plants began and where seed agriculture began. So let's look at the difference between these two. Oh, a key example, by the way, of vegetative agriculture is this plant called a hostas. I used to have these in the classroom, but I am a terrible, terrible farmer. Terrible. So that did not go well for me. But hostas you can grow. You've probably seen them around. They're common in really in decorating in restaurants and things like that because they're easy to grow, unless you're me. And anyway, you can cut these the stems of the hostas, and you can replant them in water, in fact, and they will often regrow, which is just an example of vegetative agriculture. So, vegetative hearths, the places where Carl Sayer believed that vegetative hearths occurred first, and that he said that this began in areas of the world based upon the climate and based upon the biodiversity of the area. In other words, he said that the agriculture began in areas where there was a tremendous diversity of life, diversity of plants, and variety of things that can happen. And so, consequently, he believed that these areas were sort of ripe for vegetative agriculture. One of the first places he identified is Central and South America. And there he believed that some of the first crops that were domesticated were the manioc and the sweet potatoes and cassava. Actually, this little plant that I have shown here is actually another way of saying that. It's basically like a starchy. It's called a tuber plant. So it's got a lot of starch to it. I guess from a glance it would look something like a potato, relatively related in that sense. But he believes that's excuse me, one of the first one of the first domesticated crops. In that area, he also discussed some of the initial animals that were domesticated. We have turkeys, we got llamas, and we got alpaca. And alpaca are these fuzzy, kind of cute looking animals over here, whose fur is used for clothing. So, in addition to getting other goods, but that's one of the first areas of vegetative agriculture. Secondly, we got Southeast Asia. From there, we have the crops of taro. Taro, similarly, another kind of tuber plant that you see here, pictured very similar in look, actually, to the cassava plant. Manioc and cassava are the same thing, by the way. Got the taro plant. We got bananas that were domesticated here. We have palm. Then also the first domesticated animals that came from Southeast Asia were dogs, chickens, and pigs. And now, unfortunately, dogs, yes, were at one point consumed, but not so, or not certainly not on the scale. But yes, it does still exist in some Asian cultures. Okay, now for number 3, we got Western Africa. So there we saw the domestication of yams, which were similar but a little bit different, actually, from to sweet potatoes. Similar taste, but actually a different crop. So we've got yams. There's palm oil, which you can see here. Those are the fruits that are actually used to create palm oil that are pictured down there on the left. And the animals that came from this West African hearth are the cattle, sheep, and goats. Now, something I just want to point out right now. If you notice, follow me along these maps as I go back. You'll notice none of these are in the United States. So you notice something that's important, and we'll come back to this in a minute, is that there were no um, what are called beasts of burden, so animals that can be used for work, that were native to the United States at all. So most of our diet in modern day, you can see right from the get-go, is all going to be imported in the result of diffusion over time. Here's just a map to summarize some of the places of the world where the animals were initially domesticated. So, as I mentioned, turkey, llama, and alpaca over on the Western Hemisphere. And if we go into the Eastern Hemisphere, we've got the horse, the dog, pig, sheep, goat, cattle, and chicken. And now that's now similar but a little bit different are our hearths for seed agriculture. So similarly, we're going to go first to this Central American region to southern Mexico, where through southern Mexico we had the domestication of squash, beans, and cotton that were coming out of seed agriculture. Secondly, in northeastern Africa, so we were in Western Africa for the vegetative agriculture. Now we're in northeastern Africa. We have the area of the world that's modern day Ethiopia, and that's where we saw the domestication of coffee. Now, I just point this out because Ethiopia in modern day, there's a lot of common stereotypes of Ethiopia being a starving region. So it's interesting to note that one of the first origins of agriculture actually came from Ethiopia. And yes, though they do face tremendous challenges and environmental challenges in modern day, it's just a kind of a key example of how to further break down those stereotypes about the perception of Africa, that a lot of that agriculture really began in Western and Eastern Africa. In northern China, we have millet, which is sort of a grain. That's what's pictured right there. Um, it's kind of becoming more popular in modern times, diffusing a little bit like the popularity of quinoa, but just another grain. And then number 4, we have northeastern India. Now you notice I wrote rice with question marks because the origins of rice are unknown. It is not proven, but it is theorized that it came from northeastern India, but that is not proven. That's just a theory of where rice came from. So in sum, here's our map of some of the main domesticated products. You notice that actually on this map, it even has rice coming from northeastern China. So just an indication of some of the debates there. The AP exam does want you to know some of these major hearths, both seed and vegetative, and these areas of diffusion. So we're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail in class, but we'll see where these different foods emerged or originated and how they diffused over time, because our modern palate, our modern meal, is such a agglomeration, such a mixture of all of these different products. And sometimes it's important. It's cool to trace back the origins of that food to see that on our plate is really sort of a map of globalization. Another map. Got lots of cool maps related to the origins of agriculture and the domestication of animals. So as I mentioned, the diffusion. Most of these foods diffused over time as a result of relocation diffusion. So we had those global trade routes that we've studied in World History 1, the Silk Road, the Trans-Sahara trade route. But one of the key reasons why our plates are really on that map of globalization that I just mentioned, was actually because of colonialism. So I guess if we could argue there would be any positive aspects to colonialism, it would be the diffusion of food. But even that's kind of a stretch. So, but bottom line is that colonialism really brought about this large scale exchange of food. And what I have a map of here is that though Columbus may not have discovered anything, he certainly did initiate a system of trade, what's known as the Columbian Exchange. And you can see that along with diseases, which is important to note, but a lot of the diffusion of goods from Europe and Africa to Central and South America and North America was the result of Columbus's exploration. But it's really important to note, it's really important that climate ultimately dictates which crops go where. Just because we have access to crops doesn't mean that that suddenly we have the ability to grow whatever we want wherever we can. Climate is really what's going to dictate, not what's going to, what does dictate our access to crops and what it is that we can grow. And that's an important thing to remember, because we're going to explore that when we look at what grows where next class or next flip video. So go ahead and here, pause for your analysis questions, and do note for For number two, how does Carl Sayo's interpretation of agriculture's origins? What I'm referencing is this concept of vegetative and sieve agriculture versus the more traditional view of where agriculture came from. All right, that's it for us for video one.